to me, my X-Men.
Everyone knows one of the world's strongest telepaths. Yeah, exactly who you're thinking about. Professor Xavier. He isn't just a bald guy who sits in a wheelchair and happens to possess psychic powers that allow him to read minds, you know. He created the X-Men and is probably one of the friendliest telepaths you'll ever meet. But I think this description is just superficial. The more I looked into him and his superpowers, the more I realized that he isn't just another teacher or mentor. He's quite literally a living psychic anomaly. His mind has survived cosmic encounters, expanded across the astral plane, and he can even change memories the way one would edit words using a computer. So with that being said, let's put our dear Professor Xavier under the microscope for today's video to figure out how his greatest weapon has never been his body. It's always been his mind. And we're going to explore exactly how his telepathy actually works. Was Professor X always the world's strongest telepath? To be very honest, I thought the answer to this question was an obvious yes. I mean, how could it not be? I mean, from the moment he first appeared in X-Men #1, he could read minds and communicate with others without even uttering a single word. I mean, whoa, which ordinary human could possibly do that? Not just that, he can quite literally guide the X-Men mentally through battles, as if they're all connected to one brain. So obviously, as you thought, and as I thought, he was always the world's strongest telepath, right? Well, not exactly. The one thing I find really interesting is the fact that early Marvel never called Professor X an Omega-level mutant. He was generally known as one of the most powerful telepaths in the world. During the Krakoan era, Marvel officially defined Omega-level mutants as mutants whose dominant power had no measurable upper limit. However, Charles Xavier's not included on the official Omega-level list published in House of X #1. Jean Grey and Quentin Quire were listed as Omega-level telepaths, while Xavier remained an exceptionally powerful but officially unclassified telepath. The X-Men have quite a few telepaths, enough to start charging for therapy, but they're all good in different ways. Xavier, unlike many of the others, has always specialized primarily in telepathy, and I think that's why he's been the standard for telepaths for all these years. He didn't just become one of the world's strongest telepaths because someone gave him a title. It was because for years and years, Marvel has shown us that if there's an issue involving the human mind, Charles Xavier is often one of the most qualified people capable of solving it. What does Xavier's telepathy actually do beyond just reading minds? Sure, the most recognizable thing Professor X has to offer is mind reading, but honestly, if you really think about it, just reading one's mind is more or less Xavier warming up. When you think about it, our minds don't just store thoughts, but all of our experiences, personalities, feelings, emotions, and fears. Basically, the entirety of human or non-human experience is stored within our minds. Introduce into that equation the ability to read someone's mind and rewrite it into an entirely new form, and Professor X is perhaps one of the most intimidating humans you could ever hope to not run into. Throughout the X-Men comic and movie universes, we've seen Professor X broadcast his thoughts across vast distances to individuals, multiple individuals, and under circumstances or with technological amplification, across the planet and even through interstellar space. One of the most frequent applications of this power is his ability to communicate mentally with an entire X-Men team simultaneously in the heat of battle. Professor X, however, isn't limited to merely projecting thoughts or communicating. He's capable of altering memories, creating false memories, suppressing existing memories, and completely erasing selected memories from an individual. In X-Men Deadly Genesis, Professor X used his abilities to erase Cyclops' memories of the failed rescue team he'd sent to Krakoa before assembling the better-known team from giant-size X-Men #1, proving that he's capable of far more than simply reading minds. Professor X is capable of highly realistic psychic illusions, shutting down or manipulating people's senses to a certain degree, and mentally paralyzing them. This capability can be described as Professor X performing a form of psychic surgery, giving mutants mental blocks on their powers and even suppressing certain memories or aspects of their personalities. The other frightening aspect of Professor X's powers, besides their sheer scope, is the precision with which he can utilize them. Professor X has demonstrated the ability to broadcast his thoughts to enormous groups of people, yet he can also make extremely delicate adjustments to a single person's memories or perceptions, almost as though he's performing psychic surgery without a scalpel. How is Xavier's mind structured on the astral plane? Now, we've covered what Professor X can do with his mind, meaning getting into people's heads, but this is what had me truly shocked. His consciousness can also seemingly leave his physical body. Very creepy if you ask me. Sounds like a fancier way of saying he's daydreaming, right? Yeah, wrong. In the Marvel Universe, powerful telepaths don't simply enter minds. they can project their consciousness onto the astral plane. The astral plane is a psychic or spiritual dimension in which thoughts, feelings, memories, and consciousness can apparently take physical forms. As everyone knows, Professor X has used a wheelchair during significant portions of his life. However, when he projects himself onto the astral plane, he can appear able-bodied because his astral form is created by his self-image rather than being governed by the physical limitations of his body. When Xavier enters the astral plane and walks, it's not his physical body walking. His psychic consciousness is representing itself in human form. It's not only the addition of functioning limbs that Xavier gives to his consciousness when visiting the astral plane. His appearance can change as well. For instance, when he's visiting the astral plane, he may appear dressed in ceremonial robes, battle armor, or another form that reflects what's happening during that particular psychic encounter. This form represents Xavier's mental state and self-image rather than his biological body. We all know there have been several fights between Xavier and the Shadow King, and some of those most significant came during the Muir Island saga. They're not conventional physical fights, but psychic duels in which the battleground is a mental landscape. The opponents engage in psychic attacks and defenses against one another, with Professor X creating psychic barriers while defending against a powerful telepathic entity capable of controlling entire populations. If Xavier is wounded or overwhelmed on the astral plane, the psychic trauma can affect his physical body, leaving him unconscious, drained, injured, or helpless. My favorite part about Xavier's power is that they aren't present only as invisible mind power. His consciousness has its own symbolic anatomy on the astral plane. It can possess a muscle, body, weapons, and armor that Xavier uses to fight and protect himself. However, these are psychic representations of his will and mental strength rather than literal biological organs. Did the McCran crystal permanently upgrade his psychic powers? Honestly, I was kind of surprised when doing my research for this video that Professor X had not always retained complete access to his powers. He's gone through some really tough events that left him at risk of losing them entirely. The events of House of M and the decimation caused havoc for mutants, and Xavier was one of those affected. After Scarlet Witch declared no more mutants, the majority of the world's mutant population lost its powers. Professor X also lost access to his telepathy in the aftermath of House of M and disappeared for a period. He later reappeared without his powers and eventually became involved in the events surrounding the McCran crystal. Think of Wolverine suddenly losing his healing factor to be transported to an even more peculiar place following the events of something Marvel did do. This location was connected to the McCran crystal. If you've got no idea what that is, let's just say that the McCran crystal is much more than a big rock in space. It's a nexus of realities containing an entire universe within itself and is capable of threatening existence when destabilized. During the events of X-Men Emperor Vulcan, Xavier was pulled into the McCran crystal. After emerging, his telepathy had been restored. However, the comics don't definitively state that the crystal permanently upgraded Xavier beyond his previous maximum power or recoded his brain. Two things became prevalent during Xavier's later stories. His psychic range and his precision were often portrayed at very high levels, with Xavier exercising increasingly sophisticated control over telepathic communication, memory, and consciousness. I'm convinced that losing and then regaining his psionic abilities was a massive part of Xavier's development. However, it would be inaccurate to say that the McCran crystal definitely rewrote his entire psychic brain or permanently made them stronger than ever before. What the story clearly established was that his telepathy returned. Any theory that it also upgraded his powers remains an interpretation rather than a confirmed canon. Is Professor X just a telepath, or does he actually have telekinesis too? So Professor X is an extremely powerful telepath, but does he have telekinetic abilities? The answer is unclear, but he is overwhelmingly portrayed as a telepath rather than a telekinetic. Let's dig in. The classic definition of telepathy is the ability to read, communicate with, or influence minds. Telekinesis is the ability to levitate or move physical objects using one's mind. To put it simply, most comic fans know Xavier as a telepath and not a telekinetic. So how is there confusion surrounding the former? Across many decades of comics, there have been occasional moments in which Professor X appears to perform something resembling a telekinetic act. These have included knocking someone backwards, affecting nearby objects, creating apparently physical psychic force, or producing energy-like effects. However, these instances are inconsistent, rare, and are not usually listed as one of his standard mutant abilities. It seems likely that some of these moments were visual shorthand for telepathic attacks or inconsistencies created by different writers and artists, rather than proof of a stable telekinetic mutation. Even in major modern X-Men events, Xavier has displayed powerful offensive psychic attacks. However, most of these can still be explained as telepathic assaults that affect the target's mind or nervous system rather than telekinesis, physically moving matter. Claims that he demonstrated new telekinesis while fighting Nimrod in Savage Avengers are inaccurate because that's not an established Professor X storyline. Marvel's response to the issue remains unclear because individual comics have occasionally depicted telekinetic-looking effects without officially establishing Xavier as a consistent telekinetic. Ultimately, whether Xavier can telepathically produce limited telekinetic force or not, that is not his greatest strength. Xavier's primarily been identified as a telepath rather than an Omega-level telepath or telekinetic. His true specialty is using the mind to influence perception, memory, sensation, and even control over the body. It's been confirmed by various books that Professor X can turn a person's own mind and nervous system against them. How far can Xavier's telepathy reach? Planet, galaxy, or more? Okay, time to resolve this all-important debate. Just how far could Professor X's mind go? The most obvious and simple answer is very far. But the detailed answer depends on whether Charles is using the natural power of his brain, Cerebro, another source of amplification, or an established psychic connection with another character. Professor X has demonstrated this ability to locate and contact minds across huge distances on Earth. He's been able to seek out mutants across countries and establish telepathic links between multiple X-Men at once, coordinating them on missions without anyone having to say anything out loud. For those reasons and many others, that's just what the Professor does. Furthermore, during his encounters with the Shi'ar Empire, Charles communicated with Lilandra across interstellar distances. However, these feats are assisted by the unusually strong psychic bond between Charles and Lilandra, and that should not be necessarily treated as proof that Xavier can casually contact any random person anywhere in the galaxy. I mean, seriously, the world would function much better if people weren't struggling to connect to Wi-Fi. Before crowning him the greatest telepath in the universe, one must account for the fact that many of his largest psychic feats are enhanced through a machine known as Cerebro, or its later incarnation, Cerebra. These machines do not give Xavier telepathy. They extend and focus the powers he already possesses. In other words, when Cerebro is used by Charles Xavier, the device amplifies his existing mutant ability rather than supplying him with a new one. His natural powers already function over immense distances, while Cerebro can extend his range, filter vast numbers of minds, and help him locate one specific mutant among an entire planetary population. This will be the subject tackled next because in many ways, Cerebro is arguably almost as impressive as Xavier himself. How does Cerebro change his psychic anatomy? As much as you see him using the large metal headpiece, you might believe Professor X gets his power from Cerebro. But it's only partly true because Cerebro doesn't give him his power, it just enhances it. To put it simply, assume Xavier's mind is a radio transmitter and Cerebro is a really big satellite. While the signal originates from Xavier's mind, Cerebro amplifies that signal to a level that would be extremely difficult for most mutants' minds to reach unaided. Through Cerebro, Professor X can locate newly manifested mutants across the globe. Professor X's mind can receive and filter enormous numbers of psychic signals until he finds the one he's searching for. Unfortunately for Xavier, when he uses Cerebro to its fullest ability in conjunction with his own telepathy, it can place enormous strain on his mind. Cerebro has caused fatigue, collapse, psychic feedback, and mental overload when used improperly, sabotaged, or pushed beyond safe limits. Basically, the mental strain is like hooking your brain directly to the internet and hoping it doesn't crash. But once the Krakoan era kicked off, things changed. Once the House of X and Powers of X story began, Professor X started utilizing redesigned versions of Cerebro, not only to locate mutants, but to also create regularly updated psychic backups of mutant minds. These stored memories, experiences, and personality patterns can later be uploaded into replacement bodies created through the combined abilities of 5 as part of the Resurrection protocols. Just think of how ridiculous that is. The use of Cerebro didn't make Professor X the consciousness of the entire mutant species, but it did make him one of the main custodians of psychic copies containing the minds of millions of mutants. How do Professor X's psychic defenses work, and what can actually hurt his mind? Now that we've seen Professor X enter other people's minds, what do you think happens if somebody tries doing that to Professor X? Professor X can do a great job of preventing anybody else from getting into his mind, and that's because years of experience have allowed him to develop powerful psychic defenses. These defenses make it extremely difficult for most people to read his thoughts, influence him, or take control of his mind. Other high-level telepaths can still break through, but doing so is like trying to penetrate several layers of psychic armor. Professor X's defenses can also be visualized on the astral plane. Xavier has used psionic shields, walls, barriers, maze-like mental structures, and armored astral forms to prevent hostile minds from reaching his memories or taking control. These images serve as symbolic representations of his mental resistance. His primary opponent in this field has often been the Shadow King, with their telepathic battles involving each one trying to invade, trap, overpower, or control the other's mind. Cosmic powers, such as the Phoenix Force, are capable of overwhelming Xavier's defenses, and powerful telepaths, such as Jean Grey, Emma Frost, Cassandra Nova, Legion, and others have also entered, challenged, or damaged his mind under different circumstances. Governments and anti-mutant organizations have developed technological countermeasures against telepaths, while Magneto's helmet is famously capable of blocking telepathic intrusion in many comic and screen continuities. How many times has Xavier's mind been rebuilt? And did resurrection make him stronger? How Professor X's psychic abilities have evolved is particularly interesting because, unlike many Marvel telepaths, his mind has not merely changed through ordinary training. It's been damaged, suppressed, restored, possessed, copied, and reconstructed. One major alteration occurred when Xavier lost his telepathy following House of M, before eventually having it restored after entering the McCrane Crystal during X-Men Emperor Vulcan. Comparisons between his accomplishments before and after the story have led to some readers to theorize that he returned stronger, but the comic only explicitly confirms that his telepathy was restored. A second substantial alteration occurred in Avengers vs. X-Men, where Professor X was killed by a Phoenix-empowered Cyclops in issue number 11. However, Xavier was not resurrected for the first time in House of X number 5. His consciousness survived in the astral plane, and his physical return occurred through the body of Phantom X during Astonishing X-Men. By the time Krakoa was founded, Xavier was already alive. During the Krakoan age, Xavier was assassinated in X-Force number 1. The Five created a replacement body, while a Cerebro backup of Xavier's mind was restored to it, demonstrating that even the architect of the resurrection protocols could be brought back through the system he'd helped establish. It's been the theory of some Marvel readers that repeatedly resurrecting mutants might strengthen or alter their existing abilities. However, there's no general confirmed rules stating that every resurrection automatically makes a mutant more powerful, and there's no confirmation that Xavier's occasional telekinetic-looking feats were created by the resurrection process. I do think this is a very interesting approach to studying Xavier's physiological makeup. In this case, death doesn't merely allow him to physically reconstruct his body, it also allows a backed up version of his consciousness to be placed into that body. When you can back up a consciousness and restore it, this begins to raise the question of how much of what returns is the original Charles Xavier, and how much is an extremely accurate psychic reconstruction. How much does Xavier's psychic morality evolve? Yet another thing I find interesting about Professor X is that his greatest weakness might be related to how he uses his powers rather than what those powers do. Before Krakoa, Professor X regularly crossed ethical lines, mind-wiped people, deliberately excluded teammates from vital information, suppressed memories, and manipulated others while convincing himself that he was protecting humans and mutants. He's done this on many occasions. During the final Krakoan conflicts, Xavier's decisions became even more controversial. At the 2003 Hellfire Gala, Orcus manipulated events so that Xavier believed he had to telepathically compel a vast number of mutants to walk through a Krakoan gate. Orcus had secretly redirected those gates, meaning Xavier unknowingly helped send mutants away from Earth and believed they had been killed. Later stories show him cooperating with or appearing to cooperate with dangerous enemies as part of complicated attempts to protect mutant kind. Let's put that on the table for a moment, because this development perfectly captures the way Professor X's remarkable abilities have not just expanded into new possibilities. His willingness to use them without consent has also grown more disturbing. His greatest danger is not simply that he can enter nearly anyone's mind, it's that he often believes that he has the moral right to decide what happens when he gets there. What's Xavier's relationship with the Phoenix Force? If you're going to talk about Professor X, you really can't skip the Phoenix Force, although Xavier's never permanently possessed the Phoenix Force himself. Why is this important? Because of Jean Grey. When Charles met Jean, her telepathic abilities had awakened traumatically, and were too powerful for her young mind to control. Professor X helped Jean stabilize and place temporary mental blocks on her telepathy before later helping her unlock and control those powers. However, he didn't turn Jean into the Phoenix. The Cosmic Phoenix Force later bonded with Jean and, according to later retcons, temporarily replaced her while believing itself to be Jean. Over the years, Xavier has confronted, reasoned with, attempted to restrain, or psychically reached Jean while she was connected to the Phoenix Force. The Phoenix's cosmic psychic power greatly surpasses Xavier's ordinary level. Xavier was later killed in the main Marvel timeline by Cyclops, while Cyclops was empowered by the Phoenix Force during Avengers vs. X-Men. That is what I believe the Phoenix Force did to Xavier's psychic development. It didn't permanently give him a new power, but it forced him to think and fight on a cosmic scale. Years spent attempting to guide Jean and confront forces capable of consuming worlds taught Charles that even one of Earth's greatest telepaths could enter minds and powers far beyond his control. How does Xavier's psychic combat style compare to other telepaths? I've noticed something curious regarding Xavier's fights. First of all, he does not use his abilities in exactly the same way as other telepaths do. To mention a few, you've got Jean Grey, who uses both her Omega-level telepathy and devastating telekinesis offensively. You've got Emma Frost, whose strengths include physiological manipulation, surgical telepathy, and defense through her diamond form. You've got Cylon, who can shape psychic energy into weapons that make her one of the deadliest psionic fighters in close combat. Not to mention characters such as Xavier's nemesis, the Shadow King, and other top-tier telepaths. Xavier's different from all the characters above. His games operate on a strategic level. In combat, the most significant part of Charles' approach is that he likes playing chess. Instead of relying only on a direct psychic attack, he coordinates teammates, paralyzes groups of opponents, creates illusions, suppresses hostile thoughts, interrupts communication, and restructures the mental battlefield so that his enemies may not immediately understand who's attacking them. It's not as if Xavier isn't personally strong in combat. The reason he's strong is that he can outthink, misdirect, and mentally disable opponents before a physical fight is fully underway. That's why Charles Xavier is effective in personal confrontations with enemies such as the Shadow King. He studies how his opponent thinks, anticipates attacks, and builds his psychic defense around that knowledge.
To have a precious few of them back.
How do movies show his psychic anatomy differently? All the same, we have an adaptation here because the movies follow rules that are different from comic book lore. People who have watched the Fox X-Men universe will probably attest to the fact that Professor Charles Xavier possesses several movie-friendly applications of his powers. He can freeze crowds by mentally controlling their bodies, enter individual minds, communicate telepathically, and even connect with his younger self through Wolverine's displaced consciousness in X-Men Days of Future Past. It's not unusual for him to mentally paralyze an entire crowd. Although this all looks visually amazing, the movies often showcase the immediate surface effects of Xavier's powers more than their complicated psychic mechanics. When comic book Xavier performs comparable feats, the stories may involve the astral plane, Cerebro, psychic architecture, mental barriers, and decades of experience. What's even more important is that in the movies, Xavier mostly remains a heroic mentor figure, although the films do acknowledge his secrecy and manipulation. In the comics, he's often made much darker and morally questionable choices, especially in stories such as Deadly Genesis and throughout the Krakoan Age. Honestly, while the films show you what Professor X can do, the comics repeatedly ask whether he should do it. Could Xavier's mind still evolve further, or has he hit his limit? Given all the foregoing, can we ask whether Professor X has finally hit his ceiling? All of the above are only some instances in which Professor X's psychic physiology was modified. He developed exceptional telepathy through natural mutation and years of training, lost and regained his abilities, had his consciousness survive outside his body, and was later restored through the resurrection protocols. He's also continued discovering new applications for his powers throughout the Krakoan Age and its final conflicts. In each era, he's demonstrated either greater control or another application of his mental abilities. However, not every apparent power increase represents a new mutation. Many are the result of experience, technology, amplification, changed circumstances, or different writers interpreting his telepathy. In Marvel Comics universe, they've never announced, and here is everything Professor X can do. However, one important correction must be made about the idea of Omega-level telepaths. An Omega-level mutant possesses a dominant power whose upper limit cannot be meaningfully measured or surpassed within its category. Professor X has not officially been listed as an Omega-level telepath, even though he remains one of Marvel's greatest telepaths. With mutant science, Cerebro, resurrection technology, astral projection, and constant encounters with cosmic entities, there's still ample room for Xavier's abilities to develop. I believe that Professor X's psychic anatomy is yet to be finalized and is still a growing experimental apparatus. So with that being said, who is Professor X? He's been recognized as one of the strongest telepaths in the world. He lost and regained his powers, survived as a consciousness beyond his physical body, fought on the astral plane, returned from death, and made countless decisions that established him as one of Marvel's most important heroes, even during times when his behavior was anything but heroic. His psychic anatomy constantly grows and changes, and from my perspective, Marvel still hasn't fully touched on the maximum this character could actually achieve. What are your thoughts? Should he be scaled higher or lower, or do you think there are more evolutions to come for Professor X? And whose anatomy would you like to look at next? Let me know down in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one, and make sure to stay marvelous.